Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who've experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about trans representation in film. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me today, I have returning Roxane Perret. So Roxane uses she, her pronouns and earned her bachelor's in clinical psychology from the University of Central Florida in 2021. And she is currently in the Master's of Social Work program at UCF and is set to graduate in summer of 2024. She was a volunteer with the VSC for 2 years and is now the LGBTQ plus advocate. So Roxane, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I also have Mel Turnage. Mel uses she, her pronouns and is an Orlando filmmaker who is currently pursuing a master's degree in film production at the University of Central Florida. Mel is predominantly a screenwriter and director, and additionally specializes in film journalism and criticism. Her research interests are in queer film, particularly new queer and new trans cinema. Mel conducted her undergraduate thesis on the trans new wave of film. So Mel, thank you so much for being here. We're so excited to have you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, we're really, really excited to dive into your thesis and learn more about, representation of, trans individuals in the community in film, particularly. And especially this being June and it's Pride Month, we think it's like the perfect time to be talking about this. So today we are lucky to be joined by Mel to talk about her thesis on cisgender and trans creators alike representing the trans community in film. We will be discussing the importance of representation, violence that this community faces, ways we can be better allies and supporters for trans folks, and ways the film industry can continue or improve promoting spaces and positive representation of trans individuals. So with that, Mel, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your thesis that you did for your undergraduate degree?
Right. As you mentioned, I am a filmmaker. I'm currently in college pursuing my master's degree. And I wanted to do this thesis specifically because as a trans woman and as a filmmaker, understanding transness in film is something that's very important to me. And transgender issues are something that come up in my films quite often. So it was sort of pertinent to me to do research on the subject. So my thesis is called Defining Cinematic Language in the Trans New Wave. And the trans new wave is a specific movement in film. It's basically indie films that are made outside of the studio system and are made by trans filmmakers about trans topics. And trans filmmakers doesn't necessarily mean trans directors. It could mean trans actors, trans cinematographers, basically any key creative elements, if if there's a trans person involved. So what I wanted to do with my thesis was, because there was just so little research on the subject, I wanted to sort of look at a cross-section of these films by trans filmmakers and sort of understand the commonalities of them that make them different from films about trans people that were written by cis people. And ultimately, I do believe that the results that I found were sort of obvious, sort of staring at me, it's almost like hidden in plain sight. But I still think it was very, very beneficial to do the research and to analyze the films through the models that I chose. And I hope that with the models that I did choose to analyze the films, future scholars can look to those as sort of a litmus test to understand trans representation in film.
That's incredible. Thank you so much for all of the work that you do. I would love to see, and we'll talk a little bit about, the projects that you have worked on and what you are working on for the future, so that we can get connected and people can, follow you and your work. But I think it's pretty incredible that, you're right. I think that, hiding in plain sight, absolutely. But I think it's incredible that it's now written down and recorded, and you did that, which is just amazing. And then also kind of putting this framework for other filmmakers to kind of see as we move forward in this trans new wave, which is an amazing thing that I haven't heard of before. And in your thesis, was kind of, leading into my other question, you talk about that model of trans on screen and the 3 submodels. Can you explain just a little bit about those?
Absolutely. So I analyzed the films in my thesis through 3 different models. The first model is trans on screen. So the trans on screen model is actually comprised of 3 different submodels. The first one is trans others. And trans others basically pertains to the ways in which trans people are made to be alienated or otherized. And when you look at films and when you look at trans representation in films, it's easy to see when trans people are being represented in human ways versus where they're being seen as objects. And that's what that is about. Then there's trans relations, which is essentially how trans people relate to not just to other cis people, but to each other, and how that's represented in film, which in poor representation, we see that trans people do not have good relationships with cis people, that often they are taking on a more villainous role, or that cis people sort of demonize them and treat them almost like in a subhuman kind of way, or they don't even interact with them at all. They're sort of this untouchable class. Whereas in good representation, trans people are obviously just normal humans like the rest of us. And then there's trans practices. Trans practices are it's sort of a broad term that refers to both elements and aspects of transition. So hormone therapy, sexual reassignment surgery, things like that. But also just general aesthetics of body modification in general. So piercings, jewelry, any other types of surgery. Body horror definitely fits into this realm of modification. And looking at the ways that filmmakers represent these elements and in respect to transness, are they sensationalizing them? Are they treating them like this horrific process that'll irreversibly change you forever? Or is it just a natural thing? Do they maybe not even bring it up at all? So that's kind of overall trans on screen, it serves as, more than any of the other models, I think it serves as a test to see if, your representation is positive, is accurate to reality, or if it's negative and it's sort of sensationalizing reality. The other two models, the second one is sensible cinematic interactivity, which is a bit of a mouthful. Sensible cinematic interactivity is basically the idea that when we watch films, we are not merely seeing them, hearing them. There's also a bit of a sensory element. We sort of feel them. We can, with our other senses, even we could taste them and smell them. It's a bit more of an immersive idea of film. And through the films that I analyzed in my thesis, I talked about, through this model, how an entrant, which is the term for an audience member, an entrant meaning like you're actually entering this like world of the film. So I talk about how the entrants sort of, when you're trans and you're watching one of these films, you feel more pulled in and you feel more immersed because of the specific language of the filmmaking that these trans filmmakers use. It's so trans specific that it leads to a more authentic and a more relatable and personal experience for trans viewers. The third and final model that I looked at was autoethnography, and that is essentially the model by which you use your own personal experience as the researcher to reveal some sort of greater universal truth about the overall experience. So for instance, of course, I'm a transgender woman, and I am doing this research and I'm watching these stories about trans people, and naturally there are things in here that I'm going to relate to and things that I'm not going to relate to in these films. And so when I analyze those things and I sort of unpack them and situate them in the greater, social and political context of the way that trans people are treated in America today, I find that that's a great way to sort of understand a more broad understanding of what these films are and how they fit into the bigger picture, and which ones ultimately move transness forward or which ones move it back. And yeah, those are my three models.
Thank you so much for breaking that down. I feel like I learned a lot about just like film in general, just like hearing you speak. But what I'm hearing is how much are these films depicting trans people as human beings, right? And as real people. And obviously the film industry does sensationalize things in general. And then, that can be detrimental, especially for marginalized communities that are already facing violence, that are already facing these stereotypes and these stigmas, that these are such important things to think about. How much are they othering these individuals and making them seem as, not human or different, right? How much are they, seeming as if they are the villains in relationships with other individuals, or how much are they really not understanding what transition can look like? Because we've had a few different episodes about the trans community in general, and how transition looks different for everyone. And if there's like this kind of representation of transition that only looks a certain way can be very invalidating for someone's authentic self, and everyone's on a different path in their journey as well. And so I can see how important it is to thoughtfully represent, the trans community when it comes to film. So I'm just so excited that, this came out, that this thesis exists because of you and these different models and things like that. And of course, Roxane, at any point you can jump in as well, because you read a little bit of Mel's thesis and you actually spearheaded this podcast. Can I just ask you really quick? I know this isn't on the questions, but can I ask you what, inspired you to kind of make this podcast episode?
I've always really liked Mel's work, and I follow her on Twitter, so I get to see the updates that she posts. And so I really thought that it would be a really great guest to talk about trans representation, because she knows so much. And I think that it's incredibly important to let the people who have experienced, because obviously Mel is a trans woman. And so I really wanted her to talk not only about her experiences, but also about the way that she views the films, because obviously that's going to look very different from what I've experience, because I'm a cisgender woman. So yeah, I just really thought that I've always thought representation is incredibly important. And so I just wanted to see what her view was on different films and things like that. And her thesis is also very interesting. So
well, speaking of that, that's a perfect segue. What are the differences that you've seen, Mel, between films made by cisgender creators versus transgender creators?
Yeah, so well, the first and I think most obvious difference that I was able to glean from my research about this difference is that films made by trans people simply understand trans people better. They understand the elements of transition better. They are more obviously made from a trans perspective. They don't feel like a cis person's approximation of a trans perspective. And they don't talk down to trans people. They're speaking on our level. And when you look at films that are made by cis people, they're more often than not going to resort to fanaticism and sensationalism to make transness seem either more evil or just more odd than it actually is. And that's also one thing that really pushed me to do this thesis in the first place, was that there are positive portrayals of trans people made by cis filmmakers that are bad, even if they're not, Buffalo Bill portraying a trans person as a serial killer, they still do a net harm. And so through this thesis, I was able to discover that it's just because cis people have this fundamentally different view of transness than trans people do. And that really isn't something that can be rectified or fixed, unless, of course, you bring trans creatives onto the project. That's pretty much the long and short of it.
Yeah, I think we talk a lot on this podcast and in general in the work that we do, how important it is to bring people to the table when they're creating things. And when you look around a room and you're seeing, one type of identity, especially if you're going to create something about an identity that's not at the table, that's definitely going to have some issues. And I'm glad that we can the way that you've broken it down in this thesis, it sounds like we're able to really conceptualize what those aspects of it are and why they're problematic, right? So it makes a lot of sense. And I'm so glad that you brought up the fact that even, when the trans individual, the character, I should say, is not supposed to be a villain, is just supposed to be a character. But if it's still created by, individuals who aren't trans, right? People who are cisgender, it still has, harm that can be done, which is why bringing people to the table and promoting diversity, especially if you're going to do something about that community, definitely important. So with that, let's dive a little bit into some specifics here when we're talking about films and things like that. So what were some of your favorite or versus your least favorite portrayals of trans characters and why?
So I will say my favorite portrayal of a trans person, at least within the films that I referenced in the thesis, it has to be the film Lingua Franca, which is a wonderful film, written and directed by Isabel Sandoval, who is a trans woman. I actually got the opportunity to interview her personally for this thesis, and it was a big deal for me because I really, really admire her work, and Lingua Franca in particular is just such an immaculate and sensual experience. It really is one of the best films starring a trans person that I've seen. And one of the things that I think makes it so incredible to me is that while her main character being trans is an important aspect of the film, and it does play into sort of the conflict of the film, it's almost never the focus. It's sort of just one part of this miasma that sort of makes up Sandoval's identity, not just as a trans woman, but as a trans woman who's Filipina. Her character is an undocumented immigrant. And so it talks about this sort of intersection of those identities and the ongoing crisis with immigration in the United States. And there's just there's something so relaxing about transness being one element of a story and a pretty important element of the story, but not the focus. Having something where we don't have to go through the whole transition song and dance every time. There are times where that kind of storytelling is appropriate and is important, but it's nice to not have it be the one true focus of the film, and for the film to be a bit more multifaceted.
That makes a lot of sense because I feel like, having trans swallow up an entire person's identity isn't fair. You're not seeing the person as who they are. And then so a film that's doing that is just exhausting. And I feel like normalizing transness is incredible, right? Just like making it like an everyday thing. Roxane, is there something you wanted to jump in on?
Yeah, I know this isn't on the list of questions, but Mel, I was wondering, so I've seen this issue within the LGBTQ plus community a lot where there will be like movies that are like, there's a gay character or like a trans character, and it's in like a completely different world, for example, like sci-fi or fantasy. And because there's like a trans character or a gay character, they will like add unnecessary, like either homophobic or transphobic scenes just for like shock value. So I was wondering like what your opinion was on that, and like if you've seen that a lot in your research.
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by unnecessary. I mean, if it really is just gratuitous violence that really doesn't forward the narrative or really doesn't have any particular like relevance to the characters or to the story, then I can definitely see how that would be a negative. Personally, um, I don't know many examples in sci-fi or fantasy stories, but I do know some there are quite a few films that I've seen actually that do deal with scenes of gratuitous violence and particularly gratuitous sexual violence. And that's never something anybody wants to see. So I can definitely see how that would be a problem, although um, the context where I sort of am familiar with it, I'm not really familiar with sci-fi and fantasy films with queer characters having that issue.
And then also, so we're talking a little bit about your favorite, and that is so incredible that you were able to interview that filmmaker. Amazing. So what about your least favorite portrayal of trans characters through your research, and what were the reasons for that?
So the worst portrayal of trans people that I came across in my research was a film called The Skin I Live In. It is directed by Pedro Almodovar, who, can I just say before I rip into this film, he's a very, very talented director, and he's a queer director, and he has made some very elegant and very interesting films. Um, but The Skin I Live In was just absolutely abominable. The main idea of it is that you have this plastic surgeon who um, kidnaps this man who sexually assaulted his daughter. And then, as revenge, he does plastic surgery on this man to change his body to be completely one to one to that of a woman, including forcibly doing sexual reassignment surgery to him, giving him breast implants, and mind you, not just any woman. This plastic surgeon makes this guy look exactly like his dead wife. Um, and yeah, it's not. It is. Oh, it makes my blood
Wow.
boil. Yeah.
Wow. Well, there's so much to unpack there. The fact that this is like seen as a punishment, and then
Yeah.
wow. So that
Yeah,
must have been difficult to watch.
it was. It was, and it's not helped by the gratuitous, way, way too many scenes of sexual assaults in the film. Um, it was very, very hard to watch, and I believe it was trying to act as a sort of subversion of this like trans serial killer stereotype, where it's like, okay, but now we have a trans person as the victim, and the serial killer is the one who transes her. But at the same time, no, don't do
Yeah.
that.
Wow. So I think that this is kind of leading to a very important question, which is, that we've thought about, the positives and the astronomical negatives. Why is thoughtful representation so important?
I think that thoughtful representation is important, um, because if we allow ourselves to fall into this trap of sensationalism, then we're going to get the facts completely wrong. We're going to get so far off track that we're just going to completely misrepresent trans people, and we are, cis people will just have a completely wrong impression of transness in their heads that conflicts with reality. You can already see that happening now with this very, very concerted wave of conservatives calling trans people pedophiles, or calling them fetishists, and that's a direct result of the media that we consume. And if we allow ourselves to continue to put out this media that misrepresents trans people, that is going to negatively impact trans people materially. And so that's why good representation, thoughtful representation really, really matters.
So I think we also need to talk about how much, as Mel kind of mentioned, like the impact that bad representation has. It does lead to like very negative portrayals and views from the public, but also I'll be mentioning it later, but there is a power and control wheel, which is what leads to violence. Violence is always about power and control. And specifically for LGBTQ plus individual, there's this underlying like idea of like either transphobia, homophobia, biphobia, depending on what the individual identifies as. And so if we continue to show and watch bad representation, it will lead to violence, and it can lead to violence simply because people are seeing these negative and completely wrong portrayals of trans individuals, and it's basically impacting the way that they see these people. And so it can lead to transphobia, and and transphobia does impact violence against the trans community.
Absolutely. And I know Mel as well. And very briefly, in your thesis, you did talk a little bit about, the intimate partner violence within, the trans community. So you can talk like very briefly about what that research brought to light that you found.
Right. So the reason that I did research intimate partner violence for my thesis is because in one of the films that I was looking at that was made by a trans filmmaker, there is a portrayal of intimate partner violence, specifically with a trans woman and her cis male partner. And so I did a bit of digging to see the statistics of if trans women were impacted more by intimate partner violence, and sure enough they are. Trans people in general are more impacted by intimate partner violence, and trans women even more so than trans men. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I think something that this particular film that I looked at, her story, this particular film sort of illuminated for me that it is the intersection of, trans people not being taken seriously, and trans people themselves being seen as sort of, in a way, criminals subverting or doing something wrong in society that makes them be sort of, them and their problems be dismissed. And particularly, law enforcement are probably more likely to take the side of the cis partner than the trans partner. So So that was sort of the extent of my research.
Yeah, I think intersectionality is so important. And absolutely, I think that, if we're seeing these representations already of trans individuals in film as seen as the perpetrators, seen as the villain, it makes sense that our culture will start to associate those things with the trans community, even though we know through research that they're more likely to be the victims than the perpetrators. Roxane, did you have something you wanted to jump in on?
Yes, I know you and I, Mel, talked about trans misogyny, but I was wondering if you could explain what that is and how trans misogyny can lead to violence against trans women specifically.
Yeah, so trans misogyny is specifically discrimination against trans women. It differs from transphobia in that trans masculine people are not subjects to the same kind of treatment by society that trans feminine people are. And in particular, trans feminine people are, I think, more visible than trans masculine people. And because of that, when you look at like trans panic and transphobia, it's very, very often directed at trans women. And I think specifically there is this culture of trans women being seen wrongfully as deceiving men by being men in a woman costume, basically, or trying to solicit sex with men under false pretenses, when that really isn't the case. But these stereotypes and these narratives persist, and they lead to violent situations because these men who might you know partner up with trans women and not knowing that they're trans might feel betrayed, which is a very messed up thing for them to feel betrayed at someone just being themselves. But that obviously leads to violence and leads to assault in a lot of cases.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for breaking that down and asking that question, Roxane. I actually had not heard of that term before, but it just kind of highlights, intersecting identities and how misogyny may look different in certain spheres. And yeah, I have definitely run into that. Trans panic is an interesting term as well, where yes, cisgender men or just men in general, feeling tricked almost by, trans women, which they're just living their lives as their authentic selves. And they are women, so there is no trick. But with that, I also know that there is this tendency to even fetishize the trans community. So how do you think the fetishization of the trans community factor into things like violence and intimate partner violence?
Well, I think it plays a huge role. I think that most people are familiar with or first learn about trans people through pornography. And in porn specifically, even today, as there's been a push against it, um, you know, porn sites usually sequester off trans content into the labels of tranny or she-male, specifically like using these slurs, and it's sort of normalizing that hateful language, and also normalizing seeing trans people as sex objects, which in turn pushes a lot of trans people into sex work, because oftentimes that is the only work that they're able to take up where they can be taken seriously. And of course, that's going to lead to disproportionate violence, because unfortunately, sex workers are not treated well in this country. And yeah, generally, I just think that this fetishization of trans people definitely delegates trans people into this sort of subclass where they're not treated fully as human.
Right. I think that is so important that we kind of acknowledge that too, and how that representation can be so damaging. And I appreciate you bringing up how hateful language can also lead to dehumanization, right? Which then those who are seen as other, those that are seen as lesser, they're more likely to experience violence because of this. So, Roxane, with this, knowledge, knowing that there are certain communities such as the trans community that face, violence at higher rates. Just wanted to ask, what are some resources at the VSC for trans folks who have experienced sexual or dating violence or any kind of violence?
So at the Victim Service Center, we do have an LGBTQ plus advocate, which is myself. We also have LGBTQ plus crisis counselors, which are Stephen and Jessica. And they're specifically trained on LGBTQ plus identities and trans identities. So they know how to properly respect pronouns, as well as address people, properly and things like that. So that's a really big part of the VSC. And also we do have a LGBTQ plus sexual trauma support group. It's called Rainbow Resilience, and it does take place the second Tuesday of each month at, I believe it's 6 p.m. From 6 to 7. And it is currently virtual. But the VSC is a really important resource. But I also want to let people know, because this podcast can be heard from anywhere. So our helpline is 407-500-HEAL. And if you call that number, you will be connected to a crisis counselor and victim advocate that can get you connected to resources in your area specifically. So if you're not located in Florida or in Central Florida, you can do that, so that people anywhere should be able to have the resources that they need if they are survivors of violence. And I also want to say that other than like direct care after violence, direct care after sexual assault, there are also mental health resources for LGBTQ plus individuals, such as the Trevor Project, as well as Trans Lifeline, which are mental health organizations for LGBTQ plus individuals. So
yeah, I'm so glad you brought up those two, because I was about to say, yeah, for those tuning in for all over, because we know that there's listeners all over, the Trevor Project and Trans Lifeline is incredible. And in addition to that, I know that one of our services that we provide specifically, to survivors of sexual violence after experiencing a recent victimization, so within 120 hours, is the DNA evidence collection, which is completely free, regardless if this individual chooses to report or not. I do know that our sexual assault nurse examiners, or SANEs, are specifically trained to work with trans individuals and the LGBTQ plus community, because we know that that's really, really incredibly important, and I'm really glad that we're able to have partners with like Zebra Coalition and other amazing agencies in Central Florida, like the Center, and Bliss Cares and all those amazing resources, so that we can continue providing specific resources for that community. And I wanted, with that, of course, those are amazing resources for this community. But what can cisgender allies do to help trans individuals? How can, cisgender folks be better allies in general and supporters?
Well, I think the best thing that cis people can do to help trans people is to help them materially. Donating to transition funds, mutual aid requests, is very, very important. These are often very expensive treatments and often life-saving treatments, that trans people need to be comfortable in their own bodies. And I mean, we have seen time and time again that, like, when trans people do not have adequate access to transition care, they are more likely to, consider self-harm, and to have a more negative self-image. So I would say donating to mutual aid requests and donating to transition funds is a very, very good way that cis people can help trans individuals. I also think just listening to trans people and understanding their experiences is very important. And also using their influence if a trans person finds themselves in an argument with someone who is rather hateful and bigoted, with cis people using their their influence and their stature in society to shoot down that bigoted person. That is very important. It shows that you're standing up for trans people who have, very little sort of material ground to stand on. Being able to help trans people in that situation is very important.
Thank you so much, Mel. That's really important. I think, when we talk about privilege, those who have it, using it to, step in when in that situation that you just described is really powerful and key. And then also, I love always, it seems like such a simple thing, but it's so impactful to just listen and hear people's stories and learn more.
It's really important to use your privilege in order to say something, because trans individuals endure transphobia most definitely on a daily basis, which is probably exhausting to have to argue about existing. If you're near a trans person, as Mel said, and it happens, instead of just watching, you have to step in and say something, because it's first of all protecting the trans person, because hateful language can escalate, and also it can have very strong emotional impacts on the person. So being able to step in and say something is really important.
Yeah, kind of active bystander, right, at the end of the day. So with that, there can be individuals that are anti-trans, right? So speaking of which, there's this term that I think has kind of sprung up more recently. It's called TERF. So I was wondering if you could briefly define what a TERF is.
Right. So a TERF is an acronym, and it stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. And it is sort of exactly what it sounds like. It is someone who purports to be a feminist and who supports women's rights, but then turns around and says, but not trans people, not trans women. More often than not, they believe that trans women are cis men who are invading women's spaces, and that trans men are cis women who have been corrupted by big trans, who took away their womanhood and yada yada yada. They're very, very exhausting to deal with. And they are really like the people who are pushing the left in this country specifically into transphobia. Because, on the outset, they are purporting to be feminists, right? They are sort of aligning with these left-wing values, and that's what's so insidious about it, is that they can sway otherwise well-meaning and politically liberal people into these terrifying transphobic dogmatic ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for breaking that down. I think with the first kind of wave of feminism, I know that lesbian women were not really allowed to be part of the conversation. They really, first, it was just really about cisgender, white, straight women and feminism from that regard. And then, from there, it's kind of grown as far as like adding more and more people to this movement. So us seeing that again, but kind of going backwards almost, is just really disheartening. And I know that there are some, people that are really in the public eye that might surprise people to learn that they actually are of this ideology, that they are, trans exclusionary in their feminism. So, for example, I'd like to talk a little bit briefly about, this kind of opening a can of worms at the end of this podcast. But, when we're thinking about representation, right? So what impact do you think J.K. Rowling and other vocal TERFs have on the public's view of trans women? And what can we do to combat that? And I know that we talked a little bit about how it's kind of pushing the left into this, hateful realm of the trans community. Are there any other kind of, viewpoints that this kind of affects? And what can we do to help, prevent this, really?
Yeah, well, I think that J.K. Rowling is a perfect example of someone who is radicalizing people against trans people. So if you look at her earliest tweets where she's exhibiting this turfy behavior, she's just saying, I don't know, do whatever you want, be whoever you want. But all I'm saying is that you can't deny that biological sex is a thing. Which, first of all, nobody was doing that. Joling, nobody was doing that. And but whatever. That was her point, which is like, do whatever you want. You can be with whoever you want. Fast forward to like 8 months later, and then she's talking about like trans women are men in clown suits. Like she's full on like, and it's it's radicalized like all these people in her circle. It's radicalized the British media, the BBC. Must have been about 6 to 7 months ago now, I believe, put out this really, really horrendous article, basically implicating all trans lesbians as being sexual abusers. And it's absolutely, I think that that's a textbook example because, with J.K. Rowling, everybody loves Harry Potter. I love Harry Potter. But like, she's using her power and her influence to persuade people down this path and to persuade them into bigotry, which I think is just really, really hateful and really, really insidious.
That's awful. And I appreciate you kind of bringing up the specific examples of the repercussions of this. Yeah, it honestly just straight up sucks. Like, it's just sucks so bad. Roxane, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, Mel mentioned like the power that she has. Like, she's a billionaire, I believe. And like she has created a series that everybody loves. And so because she's such like a famous author, she has influence, and her beliefs, which are incredibly harmful, are going to influence people in the way that they see trans women. So I remember specifically when it first became very obvious that she is very much a blatant transphobe. I think one of the first tweets that she made is it was an article that said people with periods, and she like quote tweets it and goes, I think there's a word for that, women. And I've had this conversation recently with people who seem to believe that all women have periods. And I think that that is very, first of all, not true. And second of all, it's like really harmful because you're completely disregarding like a whole like population. Like, trans women are women regardless of whether or not they like had surgery or experienced periods. They're still women. And so I think that like that's what really began it. And I also, the thing with J.K. Rowling is like she knows she's smart, and so like she'll sometimes word things in a way that the public like really does not understand. I've had this argument with my parents who do not seem to understand that J.K. Rowling is very blatantly transphobic because of the way that she words things in a way that like people from like the normal like public like will not like catch it. So I think that she's really trying to hide behind her like power, and I really think that we need to find ways to combat that. And I know you're about to ask that, so.
Well, I think it's interesting that power is both a platform and a mask. It's very, it's just disheartening. And I think that, and of course, anyone can jump in. I think one of the things is, talking about it is helpful to combat it, because there are people in my life that I brought this up and they're like, no, that can't be true. I'm like, no, actually. And then we start having the conversation further, and I'm sharing like, this is how it felt. And then, it could be multiple conversations, and that's okay. And then just kind of planting that seed, and then people start to kind of think about it and then realize, I'm not okay with this, because most people who are, claiming to be, identify, I should say, as feminists and identify as, people who care about social justice, when they really start to dissect different rhetoric that TERFs are using, they start to realize, oh, I do not agree with that, right? So I think hosting these kinds of conversations and inviting a new perspective, regardless of who's saying it, right? And reminding ourselves that, people may have different opinions than we realize, and hearing what those are, and, deciding, despite who's saying it, if it's right or wrong, or is with our values, I think is really key. Anything that you all have as far as how we can combat it?
I did have something. So I think especially for cis people, this is something that I think would really help. There's a browser extension available for Chrome and Firefox. It's called Shinigami Eyes. And I can send you the link to it if you want to have it. But it basically is a browser add-on that highlights when people on the internet are transphobic or trans-friendly. So for instance, if you're on Twitter and you see an account that has verifiably posted hateful transphobic rhetoric, it will usually be marked, the name will be marked in red. Whereas if someone is trans friendly, it'll be marked in green. And this is like, anyone can contribute to this, but it's like heavily moderated. So, usually the first sign that anyone's starting to spout hateful transphobic stuff, someone's immediately like, oh, mark that, and it's available for everyone with the extension to see. It's usually vetted by a moderator. So that's something that if you are questioning, like, is this maybe hateful or is this maybe bigoted? If you're not sure, because the warning signs of transphobia can be very subtle, especially TERF rhetoric, it can be very subtle. That extension is a really, really great resource to have to know, okay, this person is sort of treading down the wrong path.
That is so cool. Thank you for sharing that, Mel. I have never heard of that, and I'm definitely gonna download that extension. So please send it to me, and I can put it in the link into the description here. Roxane?
I really, really like that because I think a lot of people turn to like Twitter, Instagram, or like any social media in order to like relax and think about something else. So if you're constantly seeing the same hate that you're experiencing in real life, that can be incredibly harmful to your mental health. So like that is absolutely something that cis allies can do, is go out there, and if you see something, highlight it so that a trans person doesn't see it, because that will impact their mental health. So that's a way to like protect trans youth and trans people in general.
So true. And I know we only have a few minutes left together here. So I want to, kind of throw a few questions at you, Mel, at the same time. I really want to know about your current and future projects. And then with that, what you hope the future will look like for future trans films as well. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. And again, I'd like to say thank you for having me on. It's been a really, really good experience. I've really enjoyed it. So in terms of my current and future projects, I'm always writing. I'm always writing screenplays. I'm just about to finish a screenplay, which is the first in a trilogy. It is a trans take on an apocalypse story. And it's sort of a subversion of the what if there was a virus that killed all men on Earth, but through a trans lens. And so I'm really excited about that. I'm also excited about, I'm going to be producing a film for my master's degree, and it's called Fields, and it is about a trans boy and a cis boy who wake up one day sort of stranded in this sort of deserted wilderness area without their memories. And so they have to survive while also trying to figure out who they were in their past life. That's something that I'm really, really excited about. In terms of the future for trans filmmakers, I think there's a bright future ahead. I really do. I think there are a lot of trans creatives, both who are currently working and who are currently, preparing to get into the weeds, who are doing some really, really, really good stuff. I've read a lot of screenplays by trans screenwriters that have been just phenomenal and have been ideas that we really haven't seen in the film industry as of yet. And so I think that, even as there is this really, really big wave of transphobia right now in our current social situation, I do think that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And I do think we are on the precipice of this huge, explosion of trans stories that are authentic and that are interesting and that people are really going to resonate with. So
I love that. That is such a beautiful way to kind of finish this conversation. Mel, though, where can people find you? How can they view your films?
You can always find me on Twitter at Caden to my Hazel. I'll link that. And my short film, Occupado, is available on my YouTube channel, and I can link that as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mel, and thank you, Roxane. And I also want to thank the listener for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free confidential counseling services for survivors and victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so much, Roxane and Mel, for joining me today.